Dr. Lahiri, you once said in an interview, all art is like jumping off a cliff. Why do you jump?
To see what it will feel like, because the impulse is there, right? Art is an impulse. And I think it's an impulse towards risk and an impulse toward the unknown and the impulse to discover something in the process of facing risk and facing the unknown, learning something about yourself and the world.
I often felt while reading The Namesake, The Lowland, and most of your essay, that the one character you keep coming back to is the other. And it is this seductive otherness that actually haunts the reader while inhabiting your fiction. Was it your intent to build a no man's land for all of us to feel at home into?
Honestly, I wasn't. When I began writing and now as I continue writing, I don't have a very clear intention that's conscious, but I gather now that I have been writing for many years, some decades now, that I seem drawn to characters who feel or are, for whatever reason, outside of any given center, socially or culturally, and so I recognize that I keep exploring that figure. I keep exploring what it means to not belong fully, or to feel the conflict of both wanting to belong and not being able to belong, or perhaps not wanting to belong and belong at the same time, right? The ambivalence that many people have, of wanting to identify with a larger group, whatever that group may be, and realizing that in some sense it's an illusion, and realizing that we are all, just as we are all connected, we are also all very separate and very alone. And so it seems that I keep circling around this question or this condition in my writing.
Now, the Romanian translation of The Lowland bears the word distance in the title. And there is, as you said, so much distance in closeness and so much closeness in distance in your book. What is the hardest part of mapping the human soul when you write?
Again, that's such an articulate question, and I don't know if I have a coherent answer for that. I think I try to create characters. I try to get inside of them. I try to understand what's haunting them, what's troubling them, what's driving them in some sense, and in that sense, I try to inhabit them as fully as I can. But I don't know if I can say something that applies to the human soul. That's a vast concept, very mysterious. I don't think I could dare try to define that, but I think each character is an attempt, an approach, toward understanding, better understanding the human condition in its infinite variety, and also, again, recognizing that there are so many things that so many experiences that do knit us together as human beings, no matter who we are and where we come from, what kind of background we come from. You know, it's a sort of it's both and, right? We all come from some place, and we all come from a set of circumstances, and we all come from a certain influences and backgrounds, and yet there's so many things that can come of our origins, and so many things we can eventually become, and so many ways of interpreting our origins. I think maybe that's something that is common to many of my characters, right?
Well, as a reader, I must tell you, what you achieve is a very coherent geography of the human soul, and it is a privilege to be able to thank you for that in person. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, names are very important in your fiction. Your own public name is different than your birth name, and Gogol in The Namesake is reborn into an identity as strange to him as a different man's cloak. What's in a name, as Shakespeare would have put it?
Well, I mean, names are our identity, right? I mean, it's the word we use to identify ourselves, to distinguish ourselves from others, even though names are shared, right? So it's not that each human being has a separate name. Names grow out of culture. Names grow out of literature often. Names, again, they contain that inherent contradiction between who you are, who you become, and who, in some sense, created you or raised you, right? So it's both realities. It's the generation, the preceding generation, and whoever it is that either biologically produces you or raises you, gives you a name. And name also imbues character, right? We know this. Certain names suggest this idea or that idea or whatever. Names are things, however, that they seem a fixed reality. They seem a fixed way to identify oneself. And yet we also know that people change their names, people reject their names, people have conflicts with their names. People try to slightly modify their names. People do all sorts of things with their names, right? People love their names, hate their names. But I think at heart, they stand in, they represent in a very basic linguistic way, one's identity and one's very complex relationship often to identity.
You are one of the very few writers alongside Nabokov or Joseph Conrad to have been writing in a different language. Now, the novel you published in 2018, I think, Dove mi trovo, is written directly in Italian. How was that experience?
That experience has been very thrilling for me, very, very difficult, but illuminating. It's another cliff. It's an entirely different cliff that I'm jumping off of now, and it's a place that I feel, for the moment, both, how can I say, relatively at home in at this point, but also extremely aware of being the other, right? So for me to write in Italian, a language that I learned, a language that is not part of my upbringing, my background, my life, for the vast majority of my life thus far, I'm in uncharted waters here. It's new. It's a new point of view. It's a new vantage point. It's a new reality because it's a new language. It's a new way of thinking and looking. And for me, language is writing is the act of thinking and looking and putting observation into words, and then creating story perhaps out of those observations, right? And I think, I mean, there's so many things I could say about this experience, and I wrote, I wrote In Altre Parole, which is the sort of preparation work for Dove mi trovo, in which I go, when I speak at length about what drove me to start writing in Italian, and what I'm trying to explore. But I think it really goes back to your original question about being the other, right? Because in writing in Italian, I insist on being the other. I insist on it because it's everything I write in Italian. There's no way for me to not fully occupy that position of, yes, I'm coming into this language from the outside. I'm coming into this language from my own point of entry, with my own set of tools, and it is what it is. It's I have these resources, but I also have all of these blind spots and linguistic sort of resources, tricks that are lacking, right? So it's working with a certain amount of a body of knowledge that's growing. It's certainly growing as I move forward in this linguistic realm, but it's always going to remain what it is. I mean, there's no it's never going to be what English is, right? It's never going to be that. So I think that's the game. You mentioned Nabokov. He loved games.
Great chess player.
He loved games of all kinds, and he was, a master chess player, and his novels are full of game references, allusions. They're plotted as games. My writing doesn't have that aspect per se. I love Nabokov. I've always loved Nabokov. And I think one of the reasons that attracted me to him at a younger age was his linguistic, this hybrid quality that he had, and that he chose it, that he loved other languages enough to want to go deep into them and to write in them and create in them. I just thought that was such an extraordinary impulse. And I, even though back, when I first started reading him, I was 18 years old. I didn't have, I didn't have the capability of being able to write even a sentence really in another language that was, I don't know, that creative impulse wasn't there. I had studied other languages, but more as a kind of scholastic, experience. In any case, it's a game, right? And I approach this as a game, and I approach it seriously, but also with a sort of lightness, right? Because it has to be played, right? It has to be. It's a form of play, but very serious at the same time.
You often talked about how you spoke and laughed and lived and ate and joked and so on in a Bengali fashion while you grew up inside your home, and in English outside your home. Now, you are now in your Rome kitchen, and I'm in my Bucharest living room. And I was wondering whether home is a border, culturally speaking, Is it this precise, intimate space where paradoxically languages, rituals, memories, and future projections actually cross?
I think home is, again, it's different things for different people. I think that I've come to embrace a relatively nomadic approach to life. I've had various homes. I've made various homes. I've insisted on creating new homes in very different places. And I think this is the only model that has that really can define, in some sense, my experiences. That idea of uprooting oneself, finding a new place, learning a new place, new rules, new ways of being. This is in some sense in my immediate DNA, right? Because this is what my parents did. This is what many people I know come from backgrounds in which either the parents or their grandparents' generation traveled great distances, either because they were forced to or because they were inspired to live their lives. And so that is the reality I've learned, right, that I've absorbed. And in my own life as an adult, in some sense, I've reproduced that for my own reasons, more sort of creative, perhaps driven from a creative vantage point, not from an economic perspective, as it was for my father, not from a political perspective, or historical perspective, as it has been for many others. But that's my sense right now, is that there is no again, there is no fixed point. There is no home with a capital H, exactly. Right? It's sort of, home is a state of mind. And so similarly, if I say I feel at home in the Italian language, that's a state of mind. That's not really a reality, right? Because in fact, I don't feel fully at home. But then I ask myself, and I ask others to ask themselves, where do we feel fully at home? You know, is there any place that we can really, because I think with home, with the idea of home, there's the idea of possession, right? And identification, as sort of like full kind of adherence to the place, you know, this is my home and the home is me, and this sort of thing. And then that, when people get into that mindset, it creates questions when other people come into that space, right? Others from other places come into that place and want to perhaps create a home, right? And honestly, I think these are questions that human civilization has been grappling with from the very beginning. You know, this is my land and that's your land, and this is my home and that's your home, and why are people moving around? People have always been moving around. People have always been moving around. But the interesting thing about human beings is that some of us move around, and for some of us it's natural to move around and to migrate and to cross borders. And then, but not for all of us, right? So we're not like those species that must move across the plains or make the voyage from one part of the world to another to mate and reproduce and all of these things, right? We're not, there's no fixed way for human beings. There's just this vast range of people, right? And some of them are born and live and die in the exact same place. And for others, there's never that point of reference for whatever reason, whether it's imposed on them, whether that sense of that nomadic reality is imposed on them, or because they choose to experience that in some sense, to recreate that for themselves. But these are very complex questions, right? And with each of these choices, there are enormous logistical and emotional repercussions for people, right? And so there are large questions of feeling alienated, feeling exiled, feeling, this idea of homesickness, nostalgia, all of these questions that are real. I think we're, and I can say this for myself. I mean, I can say on the one hand, yes, I've sort of created this relatively nomadic life for myself. I mean, very, I'm not moving around every 6 months, but I can say, okay, I've lived here, I've lived there. I move around. Right now, I move back and forth quite relatively frequently. I move back and forth between 2 continents. I feel that, but I think that feels relatively normal to me, because I felt that psychologically and emotionally, I was raised by parents who were always, in some sense, living on another continent, right? And we're leaning toward another reality that wasn't our physical reality. It was a very far away reality, but it was a reality nevertheless. And that reality was entering their consciousness on an everyday basis, on an every day, right? And many aspects of that faraway reality became part of our immediate reality as well, in terms of what language we were speaking, what food we were eating, how people were interacting, et cetera, et cetera.
That's a wonderful answer. And it practically brings me to my last question to you. There's this passage in the Lowland where you talk about the silence underwater as being similar to the experience of visiting a foreign place where people speak a language you don't understand. And in a way, in these past months of world crisis and isolation, we have all had to learn a language we didn't really understand. Where do you travel when there is nowhere to go?
I think you read. You read. At least for me, that was how I first started moving in my life. Was through literature, through stories, through children's stories. Even I started moving in my head outside of the immediate reality. And I started to expose myself to other realities, other geographies, other ways of being through the books I read. I think literature is the most powerful way for us to inhabit other souls and other realities. I don't think there's any art form that is as articulate in doing so. And so effective in doing so. So I've been reading a lot in the past few months. It's been one wonderful consequence, I'll say, of a very difficult period. I have had more time to read, and read sort of, several more complex novels. Very different from one another, but that is the ultimate vehicle, I think, to travel into the past, into the future, into the unknown, into places you'll never go, experiences you'll never have. So that would be my answer.
Thank you so very much. It's been wonderful meeting you and having the chance of talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.